The bell of the Hôtel de Ville had tolled as the cart lurched onto the cobbles of the Place de Grève, dragging the condemned woman through a forest of raised heads and craning necks. The Marquise de Brinvilliers sat rigid, her thin frame betraying the violence of the water torture she had just endured. Beneath her loosened garments, her swollen stomach still heaved from the forced draughts that had threatened to suffocate her. Guards clung to the cart, pushing back the crowd that surged for a closer look at the slight pale figure whispered to have murdered kin with invisible powders. On the scaffold, the executioner seized her with a practiced grip, his leathered hands steady despite the roar from the gathered Parisians. Rope rasped against the wooden post as he bound her, the smell of pitch and burning faggots already thick in the air. Moments earlier, the heavy blade had fallen, severing head from body in a single brutal stroke that drew a groan from the throng. Now her lifeless remains hung in the harsh daylight. The face of the notorious poisoner turned toward the river breeze as if in mute acknowledgement of the accusations that had followed her from tribunal to pyre. Torches dipped toward the stacked wood, and flames leapt, catching on straw and resin-soaked kindling beneath the body. Smoke curled upward, stinging eyes and throats, while the crowd murmured of arsenic hidden in sugared confections and medicated waters. The names of her father and brothers passed from mouth to mouth, joined with rumours of apothecaries, alchemists and clandestine sellers of lethal powders. Near the front, officials in dark cloaks watched in tight-lipped silence, trading low comments that this woman's crimes hinted at a broader commerce in poison, one that crept from cramped Parisian stalls toward the gilded orbit of Louis XIV's court. Sainte Croix disappeared behind the stone walls of the Bastille, swept away by a sealed order that required no trial and tolerated no appeal. In the dim cells reserved for troublesome nobles and inconvenient lovers, he shared close quarters with men who trafficked in secrets more lethal than swords. Among them lived an Italian alchemist, already whispered about for his experiments with subtle powders, distilled waters, and the slow, invisible art of chemical corruption. Within that confined world, glass vials and stained mortars replaced cavalry drills and courtly visits. Guards carried food and letters, prisoners traded knowledge. Sainte Croix listened as formulas were recited in low voices, as the names of familiar substances, arsenic, antimony, corrosive sublimate, were pronounced like an inventory of silent weapons. What had once passed for philosophy of nature there turned into practical lessons in how to sicken, weaken, and finally extinguish a human body without a visible wound. Outside the fortress, the d'Aubray household continued under the stern rhythm imposed by its patriarch, unaware of what the imprisonment had set in motion. Court gossip reduced the scandal to a daughter's shame and a father's severity, while Paris moved on to new intrigues. Yet in the shadowed corridors of the Bastille, Sainte Croix carefully memorized dosages, methods of concealment, and the slow timing of symptoms, carrying each fragment of knowledge like a weapon he intended to reclaim upon release. Within the fortress walls, Christophe Glazer's laboratory filled the air with acrid fumes and the rattle of glass. Sainte Croix watched as powders changed colour in the heat of the furnace, and clear liquids clouded when mixed. Glazer handled arsenic as if it were a common seasoning, weighing pale grains on a small balance, then dissolving them into seemingly harmless solutions. Recipes passed in low voices, scratched into notebooks, and burned as soon as they had been memorized. When Sainte Croix stepped back into Paris, his manner bore the assurance of a man who carried invisible weapons. He walked the Rue de l'Arsenal with a new discretion, visiting apothecaries who tucked parcels beneath the counter and alchemists who never opened their doors before nightfall. In his modest lodgings, he set up a furnace and glassware on a plain table, turning crude ingredients into fine white powders that vanished in wine or broth without scent or trace. The locked box in his room remained constantly within reach, its tiny keys hidden in the lining of his clothes. Inside, witnesses later described neat rows of files, stoppered and carefully labelled in his hand. He handled them with a curious blend of tenderness and fear, wiping any spilled dust with damp cloths that he burned in the grate. In taverns and private salons, whispers began linking his name with shadowy dealers and muttered promises of discreet, undetectable remedies for troublesome lives. In the shadowed apartments where the D'Aubray family gathered, the father's authority still pressed on every conversation. The magistrate's gaze weighed on his daughter, measuring debts, rumours, and whispered indiscretions. His visits to Paris unfolded under a veneer of courtesy, but each remark about squandered dowries or a lover's intrusion tightened the air. Servants moved carefully around them, aware that a word spoken in the wrong corridor could cost a position or provoke a cold rebuke. When the magistrate's illness began during one of these visits, confusion spread as quickly as alarm. He had eaten, drunk and talked as usual, then doubled over with burning pains that seemed to twist through his abdomen. Physicians examined him, smelled his breath, checked his pulse, and prescribed purges and cordials. Nothing eased the relentless vomiting or the exhaustion that followed. The household watched him sink into weakness, uncertain whether grief, age, or some unseen corruption hollowed him out. After his death, unease lingered in the rooms he had once dominated. The two sons, Antoine and François, managed the legal residue of his estate, but shared meals with their sister grew tense. On more than one occasion, one brother left the table clutching his stomach, overtaken by cramps and nausea that returned like tides whenever he ate or drank in her presence. Servants whispered over kitchen basins about this repetition of suffering, noting how frequently misfortune visited those whose signatures controlled the family wealth. In Paris, the pale powder already passed from hand to hand under half-whispered names. In apothecary shops, it lay among labelled jars as rat poison or a caustic ingredient for salves, bought with no more ceremony than a laxative. Yet in back rooms and crowded taverns, it carried another reputation. People spoke of an inheritance powder that seemed to hasten deaths just when wills were about to be read, a substance that dissolved into daily life as easily as sugar in wine. Within this atmosphere, small vials changed meaning once they reached private cabinets and locked caskets. Sainte Croix, already drawn into a world of clandestine remedies, handled arsenic as others handled jewels. Testimony later evoked how he experimented with mixtures, dulling the powder's harsh taste and disguising its grainy texture. With guidance attributed to the chemist Christophe Glaser, he learned to blend it into syrups, broths and sugared wines, turning each familiar comfort into a silent, efficient vehicle. Those who swallowed the adulterated draughts complained first of a fire that seemed to spread from the stomach outward, of an unquenchable thirst that made water both relief and torment. Physicians noted vomiting, looseness of the bowels, a slow wasting of flesh. Yet nothing distinguished these signs from a severe flux or a malignant fever. Without chemical tests, the true cause remained hidden, while arsenic quietly crippled cellular respiration, ravaged the gut, and strained heart and liver until life simply ebbed away. News of Sainte Croix's sudden death spread through Paris as a practical problem rather than a scandal. Creditors pressed in, eager to recover whatever value his possessions still held. Officers entered his lodgings, stepping past retorts, furnaces, and stained glassware that still clung to a sour chemical odour. Among the clutter, they noted a carefully guarded wooden casket, labelled with instructions that it must only be opened in the presence of the Marquise de Brinvilliers. When officials forced the casket open, they confronted an ordered archive of secrets. Sealed vials lay in neat rows, some labelled in Sainte Croix's hand, others anonymous, filled with pale powders and cloudy liquids. Folded letters, bound with ribbon, carried exchanges between him and the Marquise, the ink still dark and legible. A signed declaration rested on top, in which Sainte Croix stated that, should he die unexpectedly, these contents would speak in his place. Magistrates spread the papers across a table and read in mounting silence. Phrases emerged that no longer allowed for ambiguity. References to discreet administrations of powder, hints about testing mixtures on unsuspecting victims, and calculations of expected inheritances once certain relatives had died. Names of the d'Aubray family appeared beside these notes. What had once seemed like a string of unfortunate illnesses now appeared as the deliberate outcome of a methodical, profitable poisoning scheme. Inside the stone walls of the conciergerie, the Marquise waited under heavy guard, her rank offering no protection from the damp and darkness. Clerks arrived with bundles of depositions, and magistrates began to assemble the fragmented accounts into a coherent accusation. Servants spoke of vials hidden in cabinets, of powders folded into papers and tucked into travel chests. Apothecaries' bills, private letters and inn registers were read aloud, each detail fixing her movements to a spreading constellation of illness and death. Interrogators pressed her with the slow, methodical cruelty of the Chambre Ardente, the special tribunal created for crimes of poison and sorcery. They cited the Hôtel Dieu episodes, the pastries, the hospital visits framed as charity, and asked whether these had been rehearsals for murder. She denied, deflected, fell silent, then contradicted earlier statements. Outside the prison, pamphlets circulated through Paris, repeating rumours that powerful households feared their kitchens, their cosmetics, even the perfumes on their skin. As officials probed her contacts, the investigation widened beyond one aristocratic criminal. Questioners returned again and again to the name of her former lover and accomplice, Gaudin de Sainte Croix, already dead, and to the mysterious suppliers of his toxins. References appeared to shadowy vendors of powders and filters, said to serve clients from the lowest alleys to court antechambers. The Marquise's case began to look less like an isolated family tragedy and more like one strand in an organized trade in death. Word of the proceedings had spread across Paris, and crowds pressed against the great doors of the Palais de Justice, while magistrates assembled beneath painted ceilings darkened by candle smoke. Inside, clerks unrolled parchment and read depositions in measured voices, as physicians and apothecaries leaned forward to catch each detail. They listened to descriptions of faint metallic tastes, sudden cramps, and lingering decline, and tried to match them with the known properties of arsenic and antimony, still only dimly understood. Witnesses stepped forward one after another. Servants who remembered mysterious vials and folded papers, relatives who had watched the victim's slow wasting, and medical men who had misread symptoms as ordinary fevers. Judges questioned them about colours of powders, smells from cups, and the timing of violent fits after meals. Each answer layered suspicion upon method, as the court reconstructed how drinks had been seasoned, how broths had been altered, how seemingly beneficial remedies had concealed lethal intent. When the water torture had been ordered and carried out, the chamber filled with the sounds of straining ropes, splashing and muffled cries, while officials noted every word forced from swollen lips. She repeated earlier admissions of poisoning her father and brothers, then hinted at other attempts, too vague to anchor in formal charges, yet sufficient to deepen the magistrate's unease. The record showed not only individual guilt, but the dawning realization that domestic rituals of care could serve as precise instruments of murder. In the wake of the Marquise de Brinvilliers' confession and execution in 1676, magistrates in Paris examined old scandals with new suspicion. Autopsies that had once been perfunctory suddenly carried weight, and unexplained illnesses within noble households attracted official notice. Physicians argued over symptoms of arsenic, while apothecaries whispered about customers who bought corrosive sublimate and antimony in unusual quantities. Rumours moved quickly along salon conversations and parish confessions, feeding a sense that hidden killers operated behind courtly manners. By 1679, denunciations had swelled into a tide. Louis XIV authorized the creation of an extraordinary tribunal, the Chambre Ardente, and placed it under Nicolas de la Reynie, who already oversaw the new centralized police of Paris. Interrogators worked in chambers lit late into the night, compiling lists of suspects and cross-checking testimonies. Arrests targeted fortune-tellers, alchemists, midwives, and known providers of illicit abortions whose clientele overlapped with those seeking poisons and charms. Torture, or the threat of it, loosened tongues and extended the web of implication. In cramped cells beneath Paris, prisoners described gatherings in back rooms and suburban gardens where powders and philters passed from hand to hand. Among the most frequently named figures stood Catherine Deschays, called La Voisin, who was said to have arranged secret masses, sold arsenic mixtures disguised as cosmetic waters, and provided the feared poudres de succession. Her alleged customers, recited before astonished clerks, included titled ladies, ambitious officers, and reputed mistresses of the king. The Brinvilliers affair now appeared as one episode within a much larger commerce of death and desire. Across Paris, the echo of the executions lingered in crowded streets, in quiet salons, and along the corridors of power. Royal decrees had tightened around apothecaries' workshops, where jars of powders and vials of tinctures once passed freely across their counters. Arsenic, antimony, and other corrosive substances now lay under watch, their sale recorded, their use suspect. Physicians and surgeons argued in crowded lecture halls over symptoms, doses, and tests that might separate illness from intent. The investigations of the Chambre Ardente filled archives with depositions and confessions that hinted at a hidden city beneath the visible one. Servants, midwives, fortune-tellers, and nobles spoke under oath and, at times, under torture, describing potions stirred into wine, powders sprinkled on linens, and wax images burned in secret. Each new case deepened the sense that invisible dangers moved through familiar routines. Yet as accusations climbed toward the highest households, royal anxiety hardened into silence and closure. Long after the tribunal's fires died down, the figure of the Marquise de Brinvilliers persisted as a symbol of refined cruelty and domestic betrayal. Her story appeared in pamphlets hawked on bridges, in verses whispered in salons, and later in novels that turned her into a warning about hunger for wealth and freedom from constraint. Physicians refined methods of detecting poisons, magistrates rethought evidence and intent, and moralists spoke of a society haunted by dangers that left no wound on the skin, only fear in the mind.